thank you all. And yeah. Okay, so I'll start off with my background. I've been more years than I care to count in IT, and Linux and open source all the way. I've done a little bit of pretty much everything, so systems administration, networks, developer, more recently on more modern stacks, so Ruby on Rails, those sorts of things. A lot of AWS work recently, and people who know me will know that I've been a big Docker fan for the last year or so. The shift to Windows is an interesting one, and had you asked me, I would have said it would never happen. The picture there, incidentally, is actually the first Linux distro I ever ran. That's going back 1992, 91, somewhere there. So, why have I shifted to Windows? So Rewardle is the company that I work for now. They are a .NET shop. I know the guys who run it, have known them for years, and they came to have a chat a few months ago. They're seeing some fairly spectacular growth, but they're running .NET servers, and they're starting to look at how do they scale things. The challenge there looked interesting. The intention was to move towards microservices, event-driven, event sourcing, domain-driven design, all the good buzzwords, but in a .NET space. And so I looked at that and went, well, I like all the things you're trying to do. I'm not completely familiar with the tech stack, but when has that ever stopped me? So I jumped over there a couple of months ago, and have spent the last few months reading through Microsoft stuff, looking at the technologies that are out there, trying to work out how to take the existing patterns that we've been using. And so for the last 2 years, I've worked for a consulting company called DS. I think a few of you will know. A fairly agile space. For the last year, worked out at REA, doing lots of Docker delivery engineering, lots of stuff with all the good agile DevOpsy stuff. So how to take some of those patterns and apply them in the Microsoft space. Traditionally, this would have been just an, oh my god, what are you doing? But it actually looks a lot more interesting now. Microsoft have moved in the last couple of years. Before I go too much into that though, I don't need to sell microservices, right? Everyone here understands microservices, understands why they're good, where we're going with them. For us at Rewardle, the important things are speed of deployment and breaking up the monolith. So we want to take what is essentially a large single code base, break it up into lots of small services so that changes can be made without affecting other things, and so that things can be deployed quickly so we can start moving faster, doing experiments, all those sorts of things. Typically I would have gone, okay, Linux servers, Docker containers, let's set up a PaaS, let's make all this happen. But the existing team and the existing technology is all .NET, all the skills are there. Moving away from an existing skill set poses some serious problems. So let's have a look at what we're dealing with. Microsoft have changed. In the last couple of years with their new CEO, and Satya Nadella came up as CEO in 2014, if you look at their presentations, they're using a lot of open source in their presentations. So they'll stand up on stage and show you Node.js servers running on Azure. They'll show you, and some of the things they've announced recently, GitHub integrations. They're doing a lot of work with Docker, which makes me happy, but they're also doing a lot of work with other things as well. So PHP, they've introduced Z-Ray support if people are doing PHP. Apparently that's a thing. There's a whole bunch of this sort of thing, and I think what's happened is Microsoft traditionally said Windows is the crown jewels. If you're going to do anything with our software, you have to be running on Windows. Windows is the thing that we want to sell in. That seems to have died away, and I think Azure has actually, I want to say Azure has killed Windows. The company seems to have refocused on Azure as a platform and cloud services and microservices. If you look at how they're doing things in Azure, they're producing a whole bunch of services in there, and they're producing them as RESTful APIs. And they're going to market and saying, look, we don't care how you access these, we're making clean APIs, we're making little services, guys, go for your life. They announced today that they're rolling out support for Android and iOS devices on Windows 10, so that all this stuff is about interoperability. It's about no longer saying if you're going to run Microsoft tech, you're going to do it on Windows, and instead recognizing that their customers are running heterogeneous systems and they need to support that. The cynical side of me says that this is just they've been beaten comprehensively in the market and they know they need to move. That may be the case. The end result is good enough at this stage. So we'll see how it goes. I had a conversation earlier. For those who've been in IT long enough, you might remember the old embrace, extend, extinguish. Microsoft went through that years ago. This feels different. It doesn't feel like they're trying to subvert the things that they're integrating with. It feels more like they're actually recognizing that they need to integrate. So we'll see. So in terms of the technologies that we're working with, the technologies that are there already, Azure actually looks like a really interesting platform. Now I have to preface this by saying that at Rewardle we are not using Azure, we're using AWS right now because that's where we were when we got there, or when I got there. But we are keeping an eye on Azure and will actively investigate it later. There's a number of interesting things going on. As I say, everything that they're producing in the Azure cloud, they're producing with nice clean APIs that don't require you to be running, Windows DLLs. App Service and Service Fabric for microservices, both of these look really interesting. So App Service is a way to take essentially a microservice, a Windows app, and just upload it without having to worry too much about servers and things. Service Fabric is their PaaS. So it does the orchestration, provisioning of external resources, all the sorts of things you expect the PaaS to do. They've both got slight twists on them, as you'd expect, so they're a little different. But then if you're looking in the PaaS space, every PaaS is a little bit different to every other one at the moment. So, .NET Core has gone open source. Code from CLR is moving back to Mono and vice versa. Microsoft are keeping a very tight rein on what actually goes into their code. So it's open source, but fairly tightly controlled in terms of how code gets in there. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing, and there's certainly other projects out there that have similar levels of control. PowerShell and DSC. So PowerShell, DSC is desired state configuration. It's their provisioning tool. They just recently announced DSC support for Linux, so you can write. It's a declarative language for saying how you want your servers set up and then provisioning them, and you can apparently control Linux servers with that. I am not using DSC right now and will not comment on the wisdom of that. But this does put them head to head with things like Chef and Puppet. At the same time, they're also supporting Chef and Puppet. So Chef, there's a Windows Kitchen. Puppet, there's, I can't remember what it's called, but there's support for Windows servers in Puppet as well. PowerShell, I'm actually really impressed with. As somebody so most of my coding's been Python over the term of my career. I've done a reasonable amount of Ruby, quite a bit of Bash, some Perl. PowerShell's actually worth a look. It's kind of a scripting language, but it's an object-oriented scripting language, I guess. So where Bash is very document, and Unix generally is very document-oriented, you've got your grep, your sed, your awk. PowerShell, if you're piping things from one command to another, you're piping objects rather than piping pieces of text. So there's some really powerful tricks in there, and I'm actually quite enjoying learning PowerShell and figuring out how all that works. OWIN. Finally, OWIN is, it was actually originally a community-led effort. It's inspired by Rack, Node.js and the Python WSGI, so it's a specification rather than a particular piece of code. It's cross-platform, but it's basically a specification of the interface between your middleware and the rest of the server. There's not a huge variety of servers that it hooks into right now. Katana has become ASP.NET 5, so that gives you the framework. Nancy is I guess an alternative to IIS. I'm still feeling my way in this space a little bit, but basically Owin gives you the ability to write websites that aren't tied strongly to IIS. So typically, previously, if you've been developing an IIS site, you'd be using system.web and have all sorts of dependencies into IIS. Yeah, sure.
So Nancy's actually like Sinatra.
There you go.
Sinatra version of .NET.
Cool. All right.
Nancy Sinatra.
The nice thing here is that if you're building for Owin, then you're building in a way that can be cross-platform. You can take these apps and run them on Linux servers in Docker containers with Mono or with the .NET 5 Docker containers. We're starting to see Microsoft explicitly supporting that sort of cross-platform behavior, which I think is really interesting. It also means that you're not tied to running the IIS behemoth. Somebody pointed out system.web is it's a mammoth framework to pull in for very little gain sometimes. So this moves you towards being able to write those small microservices that we want to be able to build and migrate them around. So Microsoft had their two large conferences recently, Build and Ignite. Ignite is more about talking to the corporate world. Build is the more interesting one where they've actually announced most of the cool and interesting stuff. A selection of things that they announced there. Server Nano, I'm actually really looking forward to this one. This is interesting. So you've got Windows Server, which is a full-blown Windows. You've got Windows Core, which is a cut-down version of that still has a GUI. Server Nano is coming shortly, and I guess the simplest way to describe it is it's Core OS for Windows. They've taken the GUI off, they've taken the web browser out, which I didn't know they could do. They've basically stripped it right back down to make it as small and light and fast as possible. And the idea is that you'll be provisioning to it probably with containers, probably via PowerShell, DSC, maybe WinRM, but it's very much they seem to finally realise that the whole clicky thing doesn't work for DevOps. Service Fabric they announced at Build, so this is their new PaaS. Everybody has to announce a PaaS, it's kind of mandatory at the moment. It actually looks really interesting. Again, I haven't had a chance to have a play with it yet, but if you're doing microservices, and especially if you're doing microservices on Azure, this is well worth a look. GitHub integrations, so if you're developing in Visual Studio, particularly Visual Studio Online, they have TFS, which I can't help but think of as Team Fortress Server, but it's Team Foundation. There you go. GitHub is a direct competitor there, and they've just announced plugins for Visual Studio to integrate directly with GitHub, search tools so you can search across GitHub direct from Visual Studio, support for GitHub Enterprise on Azure, so if you want to run your own GitHub Enterprise on Azure, you can do that. It's an interesting move, and some of their so this wasn't at Build, but this was earlier. The .NET CLR5 open sourcing happened on GitHub, not on their Codeplex, because nobody's on their system, right? And they actually came out and said, look, this is where all the people are. There was one of the guys who said, look, I took one of my personal projects, moved it from the Microsoft open source repositories to GitHub and suddenly started getting commits. So of course we're going to release our stuff on GitHub instead of our own platform. That's almost unheard of, but they seem to be recognizing it. And containers. It's mandatory to have a shipping thing there. There's two different types of containers that Microsoft have announced. They're working really heavily with Docker to provide Docker support. So Docker client runs on Windows, has done for a little while. Docker machine runs on Windows. If you've got Windows and can use Hyper-V, Docker machine provisions to Hyper-V really nicely. I've been using that myself. It's a great way to manage, to play around with Docker on a Windows desktop. But they announced that they'll be supporting Windows Docker containers, so you'll be able to run Windows applications in a Docker container under the Docker ecosystem. They also, at the same time, announced this thing called Hyper-V containers, or Windows, what do they call them? No, I think it's actually Hyper-V containers, which appear to be halfway between a Hyper-V server and a Docker container. So it's more insulated than a Docker container, but less heavyweight than running a full VM. That appears to have come out of a thing called Drawbridge, so Microsoft have been working on containerization for quite a few years. They had a research lab project called Drawbridge. There's published papers back to 2011 about this stuff. They've seemingly closed Drawbridge but taken the ideas from that to build their own new alternative. We're still waiting to see what comes out of that, but it gives you some gradated options for containerization and therefore for microservices on Windows. The .NET 5 container is worth a mention. There is a officially supported Microsoft .NET 5 Docker container in the Docker indexes. So if you want to run .NET 5 on Linux, you can just grab the container and run it that way. And they're maintaining that now. And Visual Studio plugin for Docker. I would promise that this is the last time I'll say that word, but probably not. So yeah, so apparently you can now publish direct from Visual Studio into a Docker container and provision it, which is great, given that you can't. Well, you can provision. I think they're working on provisioning to Azure at the moment, but fundamentally, if you're going to run Docker containers on Azure, you're going to run Linux hosts.
Is that .NET 5 container running OpenCLR or Mono?
OpenCLR. Yeah. So I think there's mono containers up there as well, so you can switch in between them. So that's kind of an overview of what's out there. The other part of this talk, the other thing it's all well and good to go across the technologies and what Microsoft is doing, but I also want to talk a little bit about my experiences in the last couple of months coming from a Linux DevOps space into a Windows one. This is a little bit more personal and a little bit more, oh my god, you knew, but I don't know why you thought you could do that, because I'm learning rather rapidly. So Rewardle, when I got there, and as it sort of currently stands, very developer-heavy organisation. The application and the servers have all been developed and gotten out to market really quickly, but the ops side of it hasn't been a priority to date because it hasn't needed to be, because they've scaled quite well with what they've got. Monolithic, manually deployed servers, this stuff's not unusual for a startup, right? They're at the point now where the scale's starting to hit. We can see, and I've got some numbers that basically we're looking very close to, hockey graph type scaling. So the obvious move here is to move towards microservices space, event-driven type environments, give ourselves the ability to scale. Some of the first things that we need to do there, break down the monolith a bit, but let's first of all get some automated builds in, automated deploys, and then we can look at scaling servers and doing all the good stuff. So that's great. There's some problems I personally hit straight away, and some of the stuff I think is really interesting if you're gonna start looking at Windows boxes. Boot times, first of all, Windows takes longer to boot than Linux. There's not much you can do about that. We're using full Windows Server instances at the moment. We'll move to core once we've got nice builds in place, and then when Nano comes out, we'll look at that. Actually give us some more speed ups again. But those boot times, there is another gotcha in there. If you're on AWS, make sure you're not using magnetic drives. Anyway, so boot times are a bit of an issue. Google searches, when you're in the Windows space, are less useful than they are in Linux. There's not as many people doing the full DevOps microservices-y stuff in Windows, and when they are, they don't necessarily talk about it as much as the Linux community does. So oftentimes, you hit a problem in Linux, you do a Google search, there's a Stack Overflow page about it, it's all good. Windows, that doesn't happen as easily. And you find yourself having to solve the problems yourself a little more. I think that'll change as more of the DevOps community meets the Windows community. There's another interesting thing here. The Ignite conference was interesting for this. Microsoft are trying very hard to bring their corporate customers over to the DevOps world. They're really trying to, they've got technical evangelists out there spreading the news about DevOps and agile methodologies and that sort of thing. So they're actually getting out there and selling those sorts of things, I think because they feel they need to bring their corporate people over to this space. Again, that's a pretty big shift for them. Hopefully, as that happens, we'll see more and more community Windows-based stuff, and these sorts of things will go away. .NET frameworks and clicking, I'll give you the Microsoft spin on this. There was a Arrested DevOps podcast just recently. Those are well worth listening to, incidentally. But there was one recently, they had a Microsoft guy on who basically pointed out that Microsoft has, and this is almost his words, Microsoft has always had really good, strong GUI management tools, but that means that their command line tools haven't really kept pace. So their strength is all over here, but when you start doing DevOps, that doesn't really work because you can't script clicking. I think there's a bit of truth to that. The interesting thing is as they move to DevOps, one of the .NET frameworks that we needed, you can't find the actual, just the libraries that you need, right? You have to go and download an installer from somewhere. You can run the MSI, but it's going to pop up a window and ask you to click something. And it actually took me several days to figure out workarounds for this. And again, you Google for it, not too many people are doing this. So when we're setting up our build server and trying to automate the setup of our build server, we're running into this, I need to click here. What do you mean I need to click here? That's crazy. So there's still a little bit of hangover from that. That's going away with all their new stuff. If you look at a lot of the newer installs, the MSI installs, when you get to the end, they'll actually put a little string down the bottom that tells you the PowerShell command for doing the install that you're about to do. So they're really encouraging people to move over to a scripted, automated approach. I think I've got it on the next slide. One of the guys who heads up the PowerShell development is very, very strong on automation and DevOps, and they seem to be getting the message. They seem to be doing a lot of work in that space. Exit codes, craziness. Again, because they're not used to doing scripted stuff. In the Unix space, if something fails, it's going to give me a proper exit code, right? In the Windows space, I've got build commands that fail several bits of the build, but still complete successfully. And so it's a lack of consistency and coherency just because they're not used to having to rely on those. Nobody piped these commands together before. Nobody relied on the output of one to go to the other. They were all just clicking in between. So some of the stuff is still gaining maturity. And build server config. When I got to Rewardle, they had a build process that was largely manual. As happens, and I've seen it happen in the Linux space as well, you end up with developer environments that have special magic in them. And when you try to replicate that somewhere else, it just doesn't quite work right. So trying to get the build service set up right was an exercise in flushing out those dependencies and getting them into the right place. Some of that was because some libraries get installed to system locations. If you're not very careful, you end up with boxes that have several versions of libraries installed. You run the command and it goes, yep, that's fine, I've got all my dependencies. Okay, great, let's take it over here and run an ms build command and, oh, well, where's my dependencies gone? So trying to flush all that out. Having said that, Visual Studio uses a thing called NuGet, which is a packaging system which is actually really nice. And most of your dependencies you'll find there. There are one or two that I struggled with, but most of them you'll find there. The .NET Framework clicky installs I've already ranted about. NuGet dependencies. We settled on BuildKite. So one of the other things is when you're looking at build servers, so AppVeyor has a good name as a build server, but you can't go out and use CircleCI, Travis. A lot of the new school build servers that are out there just don't support Windows. So that trimmed down my list of possible build servers really quickly. BuildKite is nice. They're, I think, local guys, Melbourne guys. They have, it's an agent-based system, so you run the builds. They have a central server that you hook up to your GitHub, but then you install your own agents. And we have Windows agents running a little Go binary that knows how to get builds and run builds, and it all works almost as nicely on Windows as it does on Linux. So that's good. But I must admit I chickened out of trying to install Jenkins on Windows. The other interesting one is because you get libraries installed to system locations, it's really easy to end up with a build box that ends up special over time as well. So we all know the dangers of build servers that share library installations between builds. That stuff can happen really easily in a Windows space, so worth keeping an eye on. The Windows tax does still exist. AWS instance pricing is a little bit higher for Windows installs. Longer boot times and a little more overhead. I'm looking forward to Server Nano to fix some of that. I'm also looking forward to Server Nano to see what AWS does with pricing. Those prices at a small size are not too bad as a difference. The larger the instance, the bigger the difference gets. And we're actually actively scaling down our instance sizes at the moment as we automate some of the deployments. So things that worked. Packer is awesome. I don't know if any of the Seek people actually made it or not, but Seek and DS guys, Matt Fellows and co, have done a lot of work with Packer and Windows support. And if you're trying to do, so Packer does in AWS, spin up a server, install a bunch of stuff, shut it down, image it, and then you've got your AMI, your golden image, whatever. Packer Windows support is actually really nice and worked quite nicely out of the box. And Matt in particular has a bunch of articles about their Windows machine stuff that works really nicely. That actually helped me a lot. Chocolatey is a kind of a layer on top of NuGet. I'm not sure if that's Chocolatey Nougat or anyway. But Chocolatey basically provides an apt-get-like system for Windows. So you can go Choco install 7-zip and you've got an actual unzip command as opposed to using the .NET stuff. And again, a lot of stuff in Choco, and that's growing over time. So that's a really good system. PowerShell, actually loving PowerShell. PowerShell's a lot of fun. And NSSM, this is a cute little tool that we found. It stands for Not Sucky Service Manager. Basically, it'll take any executable and turn it into a service in Windows. And it was the easiest way for some of our tasks that we wanted to be running as daemons to just say, look, NSSM install, NSSM run, and it just starts it up and runs it as a service. So those are cool. Things to keep an eye on. That's my youngest. He's always worth keeping an eye on. Server Nano, definitely looking forward to seeing that. Containerisation is a big thing at the moment. Obviously, it's a big thing for everyone, but I'm actually really interested to see what Microsoft brings out here. I think the Docker support, they're doing the right thing by, and this other container type I'm curious about. PowerShell and DSC seem to be under really heavy development, and Microsoft seems to have taken the message that if DevOps is on the build, and it certainly is, they need to support it by supporting PowerShell and DSC. This is the way forward for them. .NET and Mono, interesting times with .NET being open sourced and the feed back and forward between .NET and Mono, and there is, there's code going, I think, in both directions now. So curious to see what happens there. Microsoft have actually already come out saying there are absolutely differences between their open source .NET and Mono, and they expect that there will always be. They don't expect one project to overtake the other because they have different strengths and weaknesses. So again, that embrace, extend, extinguish doesn't seem to be happening yet, if at all. I'm not sure. And Service Fabric, well worth keeping an eye on. We want to do microservices. We want to be able to do orchestration between them. This is the big Docker problem: is how do you orchestrate? Service Fabric's Microsoft's or Azure's answer to that. So that's it. Hopefully that was useful to people. Any questions?
What scared you about installing Jenkins on Windows?
Well, there's a couple of things. It looked a little bit more complex. I wanted to give build guide a try, and Jenkins is I've run into issues with Jenkins before with how it stores its configurations, particularly the fact that it's a centralized configuration. Build guide is currently centralized as well, but they are talking at the moment about, so you'll have a company that has a Slack channel that you can sit in and chat to the developers. They're talking at the moment about moving to a model where your definition of the build is in your code rather than in your build server. That's one of the things that I think is really important. I don't see that happening with Jenkins particularly. To be honest, to some extent it was a case of let's try the new stuff. And it just seemed easier to get, like build guide is one Go executable running on a Windows box. So that seemed easier to me to get up and running than installing Jenkins and whatever database it needs and so on and so forth.
As far as source control management procedures, now that they're on GitHub, are they providing any process layers or guidance above just standard Git commands? So, for example, branching strategies or anything like that?
I haven't seen that yet. I don't believe so. There's no Microsoft equivalent of Git flow. So no, at this stage.
So you talked about the stuff that Windows is doing worse than Linux and the stuff that they're almost starting to do as good as Linux. Is there anything it's doing better?
I guess it kind of depends on how you define that. So one of the things that's
It is a space of DevOps and Microservices.
So if you look at .NET, I think .NET's a really interesting platform. I think the fact that they're supporting a lot of the cross-platform stuff now almost means that, if I want to be controversial, I could say they're delivering on the promise that Java made. And look, they've announced an Internet of Things server version to go on the Raspberry Pi, right? So I think that the fact that you can write in C# and run anywhere, the fact that those libraries, like .NET's been a really strong platform for a long time. I think Azure's got some really interesting features. And to give a silly example, they announced the other day, it's called Hyperlapse, I think it is. It's a service where you can provide a video, and via a RESTful API, say there's the video, and it'll give you back a compressed video where it's sped up portions of it, but done in a really nice way, so you don't end up with with camera data. So I'm like, did people even? But they're building in a lot of interesting AI and image recognition and video management and all sorts of really interesting things into Azure as clean API services. So I think they're getting that stuff right. It's going to end up being, you know, Azure versus AWS with Google hanging around in the background somewhere. I don't know. As far as Windows pure, I mean, the PDC's always been a really impressive. The whole domain controller thing has always been a really good piece of tech, and you know, even Amazon have their own hosted version of that. So I'd say if you were looking for identity management stuff, then Windows is a good place to look as well. Yeah. Yes.
How do you go with Windows remote management? I mean, obviously in the Linux world, there's SSH and everything on top of that. Have they got a better story around remote management?
The story is getting better, and that's somewhere that I think they've acknowledged they've got a problem. Again, the Arrested DevOps talk recently, the guy turned around and said, look, we've got tools that are designed for the corporate space that just don't work in a DevOps environment. And they recognise that, and they're building towards that. Design state configuration, DSC is a big part of that. Puppet and Chef, if you're in the sort of space where you're using Puppet and Chef, well, they'll work on Windows. I haven't applied them, so I won't say they'll work flawlessly, but the support is there and growing. WinRM works mostly, as far as I can see, and again, Matt Fellows from DS has written up some stuff that does, you know, PowerShell shells remotely over WinRM and things. So there are tools to do it, but they're not as built in and ubiquitous as the Linux space yet.
All done? That's fine?
The one last thing I'd say is fundamentally what I'm seeing at the moment is that the patterns that we are used to in DevOps Linux space are applying or starting to apply in the Windows space. That the ability to run microservices on Windows doesn't cost you as much as it used to, and they seem to recognise that as a company and be moving in the right direction. So it's an interesting platform to keep an eye on.
Good one. Thank you.